Hi, I'm Ken Howard, and welcome to the Gay Therapy LA podcast. Today, I'd like to talk about gay men's dating situations that are a no-go and their alternatives. Part 1 of a 2-part episode. So, as a long-term, 30 years in 2022 gay men's specialist, psychotherapist for individuals, couples, polycules, and an ASECT certified sex therapist, I work with guys daily on relationships, finding them, improving them, and in some cases, coping with ending them. I hear a lot about that first one, finding them. It seems like for every gender and sexual identity, modern dating is just plain hard. But for gay men, we have that extra layer of challenge, because often we didn't practice dating in our teen years, we weren't out yet. So in our 20s or beyond, we're still identifying and refining the skills of dating, with the special considerations for worldwide gay men's culture. Dating a new person can be thrilling, brimming with excitement, lust, laughter, and the warmth of companionship. For guys who don't have this, I hear about the longing and yearning, hopes and fantasizing and wishing that somebody good will come along somehow. Guys want to be dating a good guy, but what happens if he's really not a good guy? You don't really need to strive for perfection, exactly, because that's impossible. It's just impractical. Because every relationship requires work and compromise in the long term. But dating well requires learning and applying certain skills. And one of those skills is when to walk away. Dating situations can become untenable, and then it's time to move on. I hear complaints from clients about when this happens, and while it's a disappointment, it's better to know about a potential partner's fatal flaw now rather than later. So, in this 2-part episode, I will discuss 14 of the most common deal-breaker scenarios that can be discovered in early dating. And for each of these, I offer some alternative suggestions for dating in the future. So in no particular order, let's take number 1, racism. In today's world, guys who are racist are not only politically incorrect, but irksomely offensive. Even if you're a white guy and racist comments about people of color don't directly apply to you, it still shows an aggressive, hostile thread in the guy's personality to be just blanket against whole groups of people. It shows a lack of generosity of spirit that eventually will find its way to hurting you. It also shows a person who is not taking responsibility for his life and tries to blame whole groups for his own frustrations, which is not living an empowered life. In dating, it can take many subtle or insidious forms. The casual joke. Sometimes it's talking about current events or politics, and there's just this hostile attitude towards certain specific groups. A guy complaining about a restaurant server, for example, might complain that they might be giving bad service, but then they attach a racial or ethnic remark to their complaint. Sometimes it's the stories they tell, especially in groups of friends who are of a similar mind, and you see a side to the guy in a group that you don't see when you're with him alone and he's on his best politically correct behavior. It's awkward and it's off-putting. He sounds more like a dude with a chip on his shoulder than someone who has really evolved into a classy guy that you want to date. So, for each of these, we'll say, what's the alternative? Look for guys who have an easygoing approach and reactions to many different kinds of people, and the content of their speech is free of bias complaints. Guys who don't have a chip on their shoulder about evil groups of whoever. Guys who seem to have a diverse group of friends, even by the names he mentions of people who sound like they are possibly ethnically diverse. If he plays poker on Tuesday nights with Amir, Tyrone, Chiwai, Enrique, and Samir, you've probably got a good one. So number 2 is other forms of bigotry that you might find dating a new guy. We tend to think of offensive bigotry as being in the United States mostly about blacks or Latinos, But other forms of prejudice can emerge in speech and behavior in dating. Antipathy against Asians, anti-Semitism, general misogyny about women, an internalized homophobia that criticizes seemingly all gay men except him, or slut-shaming, or classism or snobbery, ableism, and ageism are all subtle types of remarks that, again, don't indicate an evolved soul that you really want to spend a lot of time with, theoretically a lifetime. So, what's the alternative? Look for guys who are confident and reasonably happy in their own skin as a gay man, and guys for whom it just doesn't occur to them to make negative remarks about whole groups of people, or to say phrases that link negative traits to group characteristics or generalizations. Their personality just seems to be devoid of that particular trait. Number 3, and this is a big one, is money neurosis, I call it. While a bit more subtle, how you deal with money situations in dating can be significant. People in general can have a lot of neurosis about money, whether it's more on the free spending side of the spectrum or the miserly side. Beliefs that we grow up with in our family of origin, and even some cultural issues, can influence sometimes strong feelings about money, which include entitlement, deprivation, vulnerability, personal values, and personal priorities about the value that we attach to things, goods, and services. In dating, one red flag is finding that the guy does not reasonably share the cost of things, even if you know he works and makes an income where he could afford to split costs or alternate who pays what when you go on a date. Being happy to let you do all the paying shows a certain avoidance of responsibility, or even an entitled expectation that goes beyond maybe someone who just makes a lower income. Watch for how he handles things when the dinner check comes, or when you're buying movie or concert tickets, or if he offers to reimburse you on Venmo or something, in part for the things that you bought for the two of you together. Another similar situation is sharing the cost of travel, like a weekend getaway, which might come a month or so after dating. How you approach the cost of gas to get there, or airline tickets, or hotel costs, or meals out might be an evaluation of sorts of generous versus how self-centered or miserly he is, which has big implications for the future of your relationship, because those traits tend to be stubbornly persistent. If it's bad at the beginning, it has some dark implications for how it's going to be later on. So, what's the alternative? Look for guys who appear generous and are somewhere in between being a responsible, frugal adult versus being financially irresponsible, which might come with the territory with ADD, for example, attention deficit disorder, or someone who is excessively miserly, which might come from obsessive compulsive disorder, or an anxiety about being insolvent or financially impotent. Look for guys who are reasonably big restaurant tippers when you go out, or they tip a street musician as you walk by, sharing costs with you on dates, but also showing some smarts, maybe having a financial planner who helps with his long-term savings in his 401k or retirement accounts, especially after about age 30, when most guys should be handling their money like a grown-up. The older he is, the more there should be evidence that he knows how to take care of his financial self. Number 4 is unresolved trauma. One thing that being a therapist has taught me about the world is just how much trauma there is, as I've written about before. Symptoms of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, can be bad enough for an individual to endure, but in the context of dating and relationships, it starts to affect everyone involved. It's not that you need to rule out from dating a guy who has any history of trauma, because if you do that, you're going to be limiting your dating pool very significantly. But it's a two-way street. You can learn to be compassionate and tolerate someone who shows some significant post-trauma symptoms or little quirks. But you also get to expect that they are doing the best they can to help themselves and to even minimize the impact that their trauma history and subsequent behaviors has on you. You can't just go without sex indefinitely because the guy has a history of trauma from childhood sexual abuse. They should be working to reclaim their own sexual self-empowerment, including their right to a healthy, robust, enjoyable sexuality. And often that comes through individual or group therapy or support groups. Signs of unresolved trauma in dating might be an especially strong aversion to certain sexual acts, like being orally or anally penetrated, if his trauma was from a perpetrator who forced that on him. Other signs can be an unusually strong anger reaction that seems out of proportion to the stimulus, or demonstrating unusual fears and avoidance of certain places or situations. Issues when you feel like he's not trusting you, or that can be an after effect of his trust being betrayed by others, especially people close to him, like his parents or teachers or the clergy. He might associate closeness with danger and be guarded around you the closer he gets to you, because his own defenses are telling him to be that way. Having a trigger response of irritability to any situation where he feels controlled or coerced is a sign. Even seeming to have too much or too little, which is controversial to say, if too much or too little sex can be a sign, but this one is especially nuanced because natural libido levels can vary. I think I have a previous episode on that, when you and your partner's libido levels differ greatly. And mismatched libidos is one of the most common topics that is brought in by couples for sex therapy sessions. So what's the alternative? Okay, look for guys who either don't have a traumatic history, which is kind of ableist to say, actually, because a lot of guys have a trauma history. Or, better yet, guys who have been through stuff, but they practice self-care to get the help they need. And guys whose emotional reactions generally match the situation or the conversation or situation at hand. If some kind of odd behavior affects you, you might need to discuss the importance of him getting new or better help. It's okay to ask him to take actions to reduce his trauma reaction symptoms when they significantly affect you, such as a guy who has night terrors disturbing your sleep. Emphasize that you want to be his ally in supporting his healing process in overcoming traumatic experiences for whatever he's been through in his past. But he's the primary one who needs to access self-care and do the best he can to do the work that people who have trauma histories do in order to reduce their symptoms and to really heal on a deep psychological level. Number 5, psychiatric neurosis, let's call it broadly. Previously on my blog, on gaytherapyla.com/blog, I wrote a 3-part series of articles on how psychiatric personality disorders manifest in the workplace. Because as I said then, people with personality disorders get jobs. A lot of you could probably give examples about people who probably had a personality disorder in an office or a work setting that you worked at and they were held to work for. Well, people with personality disorders also date and form relationships too, but unfortunately, one or both partners having a diagnosable psychiatric personality disorder can undermine that relationship's success, even from early on in dating. We all know their names, which are bandied about, in social media, kind of flippantly, seemingly constantly. The narcissistic personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, dependent personality disorder are among the most common that I hear about in dating complaints. These are often, but not always, dating deal breakers, because it is the nature of personality disorders to be persistent throughout the lifespan and to extend to both personal and professional interpersonal encounters or settings. They're hard to treat because they're very pervasive and very persistent. Guys who make everything all about them without showing curiosity or concern for you and no empathy are likely narcissistic. Guys who get really irrationally angry if you don't return their calls or texts right away, and they might have the borderline abandonment panic, the abandonment rage, or the abandonment depression if there's any sign that you're leaving them behind, even inadvertently. Guys who are unattractively jealous and question you on who are you talking to, who are you texting with, who are you meeting with, etc., when all these guys are just platonic friends. But, also don't cheat if you have a monogamy agreement. If you don't want to be monogamous, say so, and negotiate a consensual non-monogamy agreement. I help guys, individuals and a lot of couples with this topic very often in my therapy and coaching work. Guys who become clingy to you and can't seem to tolerate being without you, even for reasonable periods of time, might have the dependent personality disorder and make you feel burdened to take care of them, kind of parentifying you, even in the early days of dating. And they just seem to acquiesce to whatever you want to do very passively. Other psychiatric conditions like adult ADD, attention deficit disorder, or OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, or the related obsessive compulsive personality disorder, which doesn't get as much discussion as true OCD, but they're different, but they're related. That can disrupt dating. So, in full disclosure for a moment, I have a history myself of OCD in childhood, particularly in middle school, and a history of OCPD as an adult. So now, in my 20 years relationship with my husband, we have had to have negotiations and compromises about that. He sometimes tolerates my vulnerability to needing things around the house in a certain order, but I also agree to talk myself down as well. It's compromises like this and communicating about them which help to make a relationship with someone with a psychiatric disorder work. And he has some ADD, and I have to put up with that. But, notice we're together 20 years. It's not impossible. It just means there's a little extra work to accommodate one or both partners having a pretty clear diagnosable psychiatric vulnerability. Bipolar disorder requires another set of compromises to ride the ups and downs of this condition. And major depressive disorder requires adaptive coping for a partner who might have significant down periods. And I hear a lot about this, and I work with it a lot, because depression is the most pervasive psychiatric disorder. It's awfully pervasive. Many very high-functioning guys, with big, demanding, high-demand, high-reward jobs can still have major depression. It requires a delicate balance between giving them space and then really being there to support them when they're in that state. Medication helps with most of this, and then therapy, especially cognitive behavioral therapy, really shows in research to have a lot of success with coping with depression in its many forms, from the very mild to the very severe. So what's the alternative? Look for guys who are probably in therapy or have healthy mentoring relationships with others. They're connected. They're not isolated in their own misery and their own symptomology, but they have people in their life who can call them out on their behavior and how to work to change it and how to cope with it, a psychiatric disability. The prevalence of psychiatric disabilities, diagnosable, is just a fact of life and society. But look for guys who somehow have an adaptive coping strategy for any challenge like that they might have. Mother Nature plays her little tricks, and it just kind of happens that a lot of guys have these. But if you can look for guys who can own it and talk about it and make compromises with you about it, and strive to get the help they need to mitigate the disorder's effects, that's different from just being at the mercy of their symptoms running amok. So number 6, domestic violence. Okay, this is the biggie. There is no condition that ruins relationships faster than domestic violence behavior. Although an untreated drug or alcohol problem comes close, we'll talk about that in the second half. This is when guys manipulate you into being isolated from friends and family. And then when they got you where they want you, they take control and do a number on your self-esteem and self-agency and self-empowerment that can somehow include finding yourself tolerating physical acts like being slapped, shoved, punched, kicked, demeaned, humiliated, outed, or somehow emotionally or physically tortured. This is serious stuff, and it happens with alarming frequency behind closed doors. And when this happens, or even begins to happen, break it off, but also get counsel from a domestic violence program, especially one that's friendly to gay men, because the abandonment rage of guys like this, when you try to leave them at last, can be the most violent time of all. They can get desperate to see you not go, because controlling you and wanting you there is part of the game. So when you try to leave, the violence and the rage and the abandonment can become catastrophic. So you have to plan an exit strategy very carefully, probably with the support of a domestic violence program experts, like a support group kind of thing. So in this, watch for warning signs like verbal statements like, "I don't like that guy. I don't think you should talk to him anymore." Or, "She's always just making trouble for us. If you really want there to be an us, then she's gotta go." Or, "Just trust me on this. We should do this my way because it always works out better than if you try to do it." Or, "Do you have to keep going there and doing that? I think you should give that up and spend more time home with me where you really belong. That's putting us first." Okay, so do any of those sound familiar or sound like quotes that your friends have mentioned? That is that insidious beginning to isolating somebody and really taking control. It's part of that gaslighting syndrome, which is another syndrome that gets bandied about a little too casually, based on the MGM classic film Gaslight, about a man who manipulates his wife into thinking she's crazy to get access to her money. It's a great classic film with Angela Lansbury, if you have a chance to see it, and kind of a gay cult classic. But the more serious aspect of gaslighting is this idea of a serious interpersonal manipulation for their own gain and at your expense. It's not good. Beware of a guy trying to keep you from seeing your family or your old friends who might notice any changes in your personality in becoming more dependent or unreasonably subservient to him. Because if they notice it, they're probably going to mention it to you, and then it's going to challenge his campaign to get control of you, and he's not going to want interference from anybody else on his campaign to do that. It's creepy, but that's kind of how it works. Beware of insults or even backhanded compliments, even jokes that control you. Like this. You'd be really hot if you finally lost that extra 20 pounds. You should really diet or work out more so you look good when you're out with me. And you know what? I don't like that longer haircut. Why don't you get the buzz cut for me, will you? You look better when I guide you. Listen to me. You see, statements like that have to do with your body or your hair or your clothes or your styling, and then they want to take control of that, and then you don't have control of how you look or style yourself anymore. You become a product of his control, and that's an area that in healthy relationships they don't control you. So if any of that sounds familiar, plan an exit strategy carefully and soon. So what's the alternative to this? Avoid guys at the earliest, slightest indication of this kind of pathology, even if you have to risk throwing a good one away because he's demonstrating these traits. It's better to do that than to give him the benefit of the doubt and then get stuck with him, especially, if you're noticing a pattern. Pay attention to how your guy changes when he's really angry. Listen for stories of previous bar fights or previous arrests, run-ins with law enforcement or with school officials. Even rumors about him from his friends or his exes or his coworkers. Be aware that the controlling behavior that predates actual domestic violence can be insidious and gradually encroaching. You don't even notice it happening until it's really taken a hold of you. Challenge any sense of unreasonable control and watch for a bitter reaction when you assert your needs or desires. If you have seen your guy's anger and he's still reasonable, then you know you have a good one. Every partner's going to have anger. That's just the normal range of human emotion. And if you haven't been with him long enough in dating to see him get angry at something, then you haven't been with him long enough to really judge. Because part of the reason why people date for a long time before they commit to cohabitating or getting married is because you want to see your partner in all four seasons. You want to see your partner in every kind of emotional situation, because that's going to be tested again in a long-term relationship. What is he like when he is sad? What is he like when he's angry? What is he like when he's suffered an injustice? What is he like when he has an opportunity? What is he like when he's celebrating? So, while every partner is going to have some anger, there is a line that characterizes domestic violence behavior, and sometimes it stays hidden for quite a while, like even after cohabitation or even marriage. And that's another part of domestic violence that's very insidious, is that somebody can go a year or more before the system of trying to control you starts to emerge. It's creepy. So, in the second part of this article, I will discuss some other no-go situations, such as dishonesty, drug or alcohol problems, like we said before, and the issue of whether or not to have kids. So, stay tuned for that. If you would like to have more specific help on your dating life or any aspect of gay men's mental health and well-being or life goals, please consider therapy for residents of California where I'm licensed, or coaching, life, career, relationship coaching nationally and even worldwide. Having support for clarifying your values can help you present your best self to the dating pool and enjoy the process more. So call me or text me in the U.S. at 310-339-5778. That's 310-339-5778. Or email ken@gaytherapyla.com for more information or to make a session appointment. And please tell your friends about this show. I want to reach as many people as we can. I don't have a big marketing and advertising machine in my practice. I'm kind of a one-man show here. And so I really rely on your likes and your ratings and your comments and your sharing to kind of spread the word about the show. Because if you enjoy it, which I hope you do, I'm hoping that your friends and colleagues who are also gay men might also enjoy hearing these episodes as well. And if you have a suggestion for an episode that I haven't covered so far in the first, 112 episodes, let's do some more, because I think there's always more questions, and your suggestions are always welcome, and I promise I'll get to them as soon as I can. So, for more about me, if you're listening for the first time, you don't know who I am. I'm Ken Howard, a licensed clinical social worker and certified sex therapist. I'm also an activist and an LGBTQ plus advocate, and I have over 30 years of experience as a gay men's specialist. I do speaking engagements and even expert witness services in legal cases on LGBT and HIV/AIDS issues. I'm also a certified psychiatric social worker as part of my education at the University of Southern California. And I have an additional certification in consensual non-monogamy and polyamorous relationships from the Sexual Health Alliance. I've also been successfully living with HIV and AIDS since 1992, and sometimes people like hearing that. Actually, it's 1990. I said 1992. It's actually November of 1990 I was diagnosed. And I live in West Hollywood, California with my husband and my pets. So that's me if you care. So thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time for part 2 of Dating No-Goes and Their Alternatives.